Yes, dear, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. I will not be looking in the chat box. I'll be running an external timer. If you do wish to raise a POI, ask it verbally, but please don't budge. I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Since time immemorial, from Hitler to Saddam Hussein, from Bokassa to Idi Amin, one thing that all of these dictators have had in common is fear. It is the fear of prosecution. It is the fear of being held accountable for all the crimes that they commit. And hence it only makes sense for these dictators to try and grant themselves this level of immunity that the community will not give them. And we think this is something that's particularly useful for side opening government in running this state. So what are you going to get from opening comment in this round? Firstly, we're going to show you why the nature of dictators allows for them to be not held accountable, especially when this option doesn't exist. But secondly, we're going to give you a watertight policy that shows you why in the event that we give these dictators this level of immunity, we are most likely going to get better democratic systems being put in place. But secondly, now we are going to get better outcomes for societies that have been oppressed by these dictators and that have been largely shut down by the oppressive nature of these dictators. But firstly, before we get there, let's understand a few things. What are the natures and characteristics of like these dictators? Firstly, we think that they are oppressive in their nature and they are against any political opponents. They do so by shutting down any political opposition and by instilling fear in people. We think this oftentimes means that they are more than willing to exterminate entire ethnic groups so as to garner themselves some level of fear from their communities so that individuals don't even dare to try and contest their power. But secondly, we think they try to create a certain level of polarization, right? To create a society that doesn't have two polar opposites within politics. We think they do so by actively killing and eliminating their political opponents. And we think this is particularly true in all dictators. The reason why they do this is because they are afraid of being prosecuted for their crimes, because we think that the moment they leave office, bodies such as the International Criminal Court are going to try and hold them accountable for war crimes committed within other countries. But secondly, we think that within their own states, people are most likely going to go after them and try to make them atone for the actions that they committed within that particular period in time. So firstly, how are we going to be granting this immunity? One, we think on an international level, we think UN Security Council or the International Criminal Court are going to forego any ongoing cases or studies on these individuals. This is to say that they are going to eliminate any detail on like what these dictators have done, and they are going to pardon these dictators for their particular crimes, right? We think they're not going to take them to trial like they did with Saddam Hussein, who they granted the death penalty. But secondly, we think even regional bodies are willing to forego this, right? This is to say, regional bodies like ECOWAS, regional bodies like Zndt are most likely going to forego this. But thirdly, we think the country's own legal system is going to do this, to say that they are most likely going to ignore the crimes committed by these dictators and they're going to pardon them for each and everything that they did during their term. And we think this is something that's particularly useful. So firstly, why do we think that these dictators are going to opt into the system in the first place? One, we think that when these dictators don't actually have a guarantee of immunity after their term of service, right? We think they become increasingly paranoid within that particular regime itself. We think the reason why North Korea continues to nuclearize or get more nukes within their country and continues to like annex each and every like institution that exists within North Korea is because there's an increasing level of paranoia of what happens to dictators when they actually get out of power. We think within previous history, dictators that have previously been ousted have been granted the death penalty like Saddam Hussein. They've been killed and hanged in public like Muammar Gaddafi and Mussolini. We think this is the increasing level of paranoia that feeds into these particular dictators. So what then happens? We think in order for them to grant themselves immunity, they resort to two things. Firstly, they instill fear through the extermination of their political opponents and generally annexing the whole legal system. This is to say that when you have political opponents, like, for example, the opponent of Putin within Russia, Alexei Navalny, who was then was then killed within the prison system that then existed. We think they enslaved their opponents and they put them in prisons, and we think they killed them within those prisons so as to shut down any form of opposition to their particular party. But we think in order also to instill some level of like fear within that dictator, they also generally engage within mass killings and public and public humiliation of their opponents, right? What this does is that it creates a society that is afraid of even daring to go against these dictators. And we think these are the extents they are willing to go to. So what are the outcomes when you have this policy in place? One, we think that these dictators don't have to enact any of these measures in the first place, because we think that the primary basis for them even trying to exterminate their political opponents and trying to like annex the whole legal system is because they are afraid of what happens to them when they leave power. They are afraid of being granted the death penalty by the International Criminal Court. So what then happens is that because they have an increasing incentive to say that past dictators have fallen and they've been hanged and they've been killed, right? They are most likely going to take this as they are most likely going to be incentivized to take this. And we think this is beneficial for two reasons. One, we think that we save the lives of people within existing status quo, because we think the continued pursuit to try and oust these dictators from power makes them even more paranoid. But if we give them immunity, they are less likely going to instill any of these measures to remain in power in the first place, and we think this is valuable. Before I get to the second reason, I'll take one pure.
Speaker, do note that your policy doesn't work under the grounds that the UN doesn't have these interests of actually not dealing with dictators who are being aggressive. Please engage on that point, Speaker.
All right, we think I think anyone who reads international relations would know that Saddam Hussein was the United Nations Security Council ordered an invasion of Iraq to apprehend Saddam Hussein. You also had the International Criminal Court trialing him and sentencing him to death. This is something that's common knowledge. We think if you want to win this debate, you need to read your international relations. But secondly, why do we think this is particularly something that you can't achieve on opposition side? One, we think it is difficult to hold dictators accountable in the first place, right? Because these dictators not only occupy the political systems, but we think, one, they control the legal systems that exist within their own countries. They control the judge, they control the courts, they control the constitution, and they control everyone that exists within government, because we think everyone that doesn't agree with their leadership is killed and is ostracized from that government. But secondly, we think they form alliances with countries like Russia and North Korea and Iran because they are afraid of what happens when the international community, particularly the United Nations Security Council, authorizes an invasion of their country so as to apprehend these dictators. So what's most likely to happen is that if they don't get this immunity in the first place, we think it's difficult to hold these dictators accountable. But secondly, we think in the event where they try to grant themselves immunity, they continue to commit those atrocities because it is through fear that these dictators stay in power, and it is through the downplay of like political opposition in which these dictators are able to remain immune to any form of justice against them. We think with side government, you are able to get them to leave office. Never been more proud.
The House thanks that speaker for their fine speech. May we have Leader of Opposition?
Am I audible? Okay, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So first we would like to bring clarity to the debate as a whole, because we feel as if the model that the government bench has presented is quite faulty and actually cannot be applied in the world today as we know it and in the status quo, because they seem to think that the UN as a governing body actually has any need or want to give these dictators immunity, when the UN in its covenant is against promoting and allowing these dictators to escape accountability. That is precisely what their covenant is against and could not be used in government's model, right? So then we give a counter model to actually provide substance to this debate, which government actually failed to do. So in our counter model, instead of instead of giving these dictators immunity, what we do with the international with the international community, right, with the UN, is promote to the people within these dictators as to how they are being indoctrinated, right? So this can be done through UNICEF, through actually educating the people as to why it's negative to support this to support this dictator. And once more, what we can do as an international body and what has worked are sanctions. Sanctions are effective when they are done correctly, right? So when we put sanctions on these dictators, when we put sanctions on these dictators, what we do is prevent the negative feedback. So we prevent the denied. I will accept later. So we prevent the negative feedback loop of more dictators coming to power simply because after they have after they have, for example, attained wealth, then they will simply attain immunity. That is a world that we cannot subscribe to. I will take your POI now. 3. I will take your POI now. 3, 2,
All right.
1.
If sanctions have worked, why do governments like Putin's government still exist? And won't these sanctions just directly affect the people who are already oppressed by these dictators?
So what we are promoting is, yes, sanctions sometimes don't work, but in our world they do, because what we're doing is we're actually sanctioning those individuals. In Russia, Putin was sanctioned by the international community, right? But with Russia, it's more of a nuanced case where he's not necessarily a dictator, but he's seen as one. So once you sanction someone and the international body educates its people within Russia on why Putin should not be on power, that's when you have coups that have actually occurred in Russia, which then signals to the people that Putin is not necessarily a leader that they must subscribe to or just allowed to rule over them. So that's when we now have coups from the people. And in our world, we would much rather have violence from the people trying to seek retribution rather than them just being docile and allowing these leaders to simply commit mass murders simply because they have immunity afterwards. That is simply not a world that we subscribe to, and in that case, our counter are more effective in getting rid of these dictators, right? So now moving into our main lines of argumentation. So what does this motion actually do, and what does government do? At the heart of it, it undermines the legal system internationally. In the world, it undermines it completely. Because what you're doing is you're sending a message to society that murder is okay, that abusing human rights is okay. That is simply something that we cannot subscribe to, and why we do not think that their model is actually effective. What does this do? It allows for these people to escape accountability for their actions, right? So it reinforces the idea that people are above the law simply because they're a leader. That is something that we cannot subscribe to. And in our counter model, we explained as to how we will encourage people to go against these leaders if they are problematic, and then have coups be and have coups as a result, or have the ICJ and the sanction and the UN Sanction Committee actually going against these people instead of just giving them the easy pass out, which we simply cannot do. And then what more do we have? Right, as our second argument, it simply perpetuates a cycle of impunity and dictators itself. Because what are you doing? By promoting this immunity and by allowing immunity, you have people who were not necessarily wanting to be a dictator before, but now because of greed, right? So people come to power. So to effectively analyze this, people will come to power, right? But they will only want to come to power for a certain term, right? But then after that, they do not mind committing human rights abuses, because after their term is over, they are simply fine. They can just leave the country and not have to go any lawful process, any due process. So it simply allows them. So essentially, it allows the cycle of dictatorships to carry on within society. And that is a world that we simply cannot subscribe to. And our counter model actually goes against this by fostering that thinking within a society that is being perpetrated by a dictator. And then we would also like to argue how their model simply does not work or does not make sense. Because in the Prime Minister's opening lines, they stated which was quite ludicrous, that dictators are afraid. They are not afraid of the international world. Seeing as Kim Jong-un, who had threat from the USA, if he was to use missiles, it would result in war. To me, dictatorships, well, dictators are not afraid. They, simply put, they are not afraid. Accepted. 3, 2, 1. So I'll be moving on to why this framing of the debate does not work, because dictators are not afraid. It is quite the opposite. What they are afraid of is not the justice system, but not being successful in achieving their goal as a dictator. So once we are able to negate any goals that they may achieve, that is a world that we subscribe to. One where a dictator is not afraid. They are simply afraid of losing power, and therefore they have no need to subscribe to the motion, which is actually an offer. It offers them this option. It gives dictators an option, and this is something that dictators don't necessarily have to accept, and they probably will not accept, because dictators have an inherent need to want to control. So essentially, they are number one. Why would they ever unsubscribe from a government that benefits them as itself? And through that, if a dictator does not find it feasible to actually just accept this offer, then their motion and their model simply does not hold any ground in the context of this debate. And for that, we have never been more proud to oppose.
The House Chair's leader of opposition for that fine speech. May we have the PM?
Please confirm that I'm audible.
You are very audible.
Okay. I'd just like to again thank my partner for getting me to this final, and also just to thank my coaches for bearing with me even when I run stupid cases. So I hope that you can at least be happy that this is probably not a stupid case. So I'll be taking my PYs verbally. I will not be looking at the chat, and I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we tell you that the biggest grievance and the biggest sin that any dictator can do is to take away your choice and to take away the democracy that you ought to have been given by society. Redress is to give them back their choice. And on SideGov, we are the only ones who are able to do that, and for that we are very proud to propose 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm just going to quickly deal with the case. Then I'm going to bring to you our final things into this debate. And so I think that is the only way for us to principally justify, and the only way for us to principally give these individuals redress for the crimes that were committed against them is to expedite the process of selling democracy. And thirdly, I'm going to give you the way up and comparative and prove as to why we're already winning this debate. But panel, just quite a few things of clarity. Just to fight a few points of clarity in terms of isolated rebuttal, as to what we're getting from the leader of opposition. Within it, realistically, in the majority of their speech, Brooklyn has lied to us, panel. First of all, we get the idea that it's not the UN's jurisdiction to give these individuals their immunity. Panel, the UNSC exists, the ICC exists, the ICJ exists. One, even if this was true, that's just this is just policy squibble. But 2, this is just the whole role of the UN to be able to help people and to stop death. If removing a dictator is going to stop death, we think that then becomes the role of the UN. 2, on their counter policy. Let's just deal with the counter policy very quickly. We can get 2 ideas from them. 1, we're going to educate individuals so they can form coups. Panel, this is already happening in status quo. We see that these individuals are being oppressed. Individuals who are trying to form counter movements and counter narratives to dictators are dying. This looks like Alexei Navalny in Russia. This looks like this the fact that there is no political opposition in North Korea. We don't think that this idea was realistic in the first place, when there are no systems which exist for individuals to be able to get internal redress. When the dictatorships were so easy to break down and was so easy to move away, that would just be done inside a skull. But 2, we think that all of these options we're talking about are probably also going to be able to be tried on our side of the house. And when these options fail, that is when we then offer these individuals immunity to leave power. I think that becomes much more realistic. We don't particularly get any exclusivity on side of the house. 1, but 2, don't get any solvency. 3, panel, we get this idea that we're going to be dehumanizing abusers. We're going to be saying that killing people was good and everybody's going to want to become a dictator. But again, panel, we bring this down as a particularly unrealistic idea. But we think it's not that easy to become a dictator. Becoming a dictator requires a lot of power. It requires for it to be very poor legal systems, and requires It requires for you to be able to entrench a large amount of control within a country. We think this is just a very unrealistic idea. If it's like that was true, we saw that the defendants in status quo don't really receive any for punishment to a great extent, and they're able to stay in power for a very long time. This looks like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, but we don't see everybody just suddenly becoming a dictator. We think that was a particularly unrealistic idea. But four panelists, a little bit of defensive. We get the idea that like dictators don't have any fear, and we think that this was just like a very great miscalculation of what my first speaker is telling you. We're telling you that dictators are paranoid because dictators do not want to be put into a situation in which they're going to be killed by the ICC because they're going to be killed because they've been sentenced by the ICC. That is why they stop political opponents. If dictators had no fear, why would they be stopping political opponents? Why would they be performing mass killings? We think that was also very unrealistic on this side of the house. But to find out that even if we do buy into the idea that these dictators don't have fear, we still think that at a point in time, it's much more beneficial for them to be able to beneficial for them to be able to leave power and to never have to be held accountable for any of their actions, just because of the fact that you don't get that level of accountability. I think that in itself becomes valuable. But fine, Bado, what then becomes my extension in this debate? Before I move on, I'll take your point. I'll take from closing, thank you.
All right, so at the end of the day, Speaker, recognize that even if this immunity exists, they still also have the same immunity in these presidential powers. So they don't really have any real incentive to actually take this immunity. Please give us real reasons why your case still stands.
We think that this was just particularly unrealistic from closing opposition. We obviously don't bring a case that like says, oh, immunity doesn't work or people don't have immunity in the actual speech. We think that's just like a miscalculation of what the motion is trying to do. I think this like was a very poorly thought out POI. So now moving on to my extension panel, why do you particularly think that principally the only way to redress the harm that is caused by dictators is to expedite the process of ensuring that democracy is able to exist in society? We have to understand one key thing here. When an individual is a dictator, the cardinal sin that they make and thing that they do, which is the worst, is they remove individuals' choice to pick who they put into power, and they remove individuals' choice to be able to pick who is putting policies in for them. I think that in itself becomes very problematic. I think that is what they do. That's the most important thing that we do. We understand that, like on op, they might say that like the majority of what like they respond to this op would be that, oh, but we think that they commit other crimes such as killing people and such as all of these other forms of entrenchment of their power. But we don't particularly think that it is possible to release individuals for these crimes. Even if you kill that dictator, you're not going to bring back anybody. You're not going to stop these individuals from being oppressed. That's not going to happen. Within the killing of the dictator is something which is only symbolic and doesn't really achieve anything. Where do we actually achieve something? Is on the side of the house where these individuals take these deals, they are put out of power. What then happens is that after that, we get individuals putting legal systems and putting democratic systems into these countries and entrenching values of democracy within these areas. That's going to be a system.
POI.
Three, two, okay.
So you say that political systems can be put back in place, but who are they supposed to be put back in place? Because your first speaker stated that any opposition will be crushed. So who's going to do it, Speaker?
That's very unrealistic. The reason the opposition is being crushed is because the dictators are there. When we take out the dictators, opposition parties are able to flourish. There's going to be much more chance of like of the system being able to flourish. That was particularly not what we not POI. But secondly, let's talk about why the existing systems are very much unlikely to work, one, but two, why they're particularly harmful. Let's take, for example, Russia and North Korea. Let's look at what measures have been taken against them. We think that one, as they've told you, there's been sanctions being put into place. What have these sanctions done for society? One, we particularly think that individuals who are within Russia, the individuals who are being oppressed by Putin and who have their choice being stolen from them are the ones who are suffering, while Putin is still eating his caviar every single night and enjoying his life. We don't particularly think this was ever going to be fair. We don't particularly think that it is fair for Putin to be able to benefit or other individuals are suffering. We think that sanctions are disproportionate disproportionate and they don't work. But second, you know, the entire international community is the one which is going to be negatively impacted. This looks like how wheat prices and oil prices went up after Russia was then sanctioned. But three, let's look at North Korea, for example. North Korea is there's active movements trying to get them out of power. However, they've just been nuclearizing and they've been entrenching more power. We don't see how there's going to be any sovereignty on the side of the house, but we don't take immediate action. We are the side which causes change. We're the side which wins this debate. How to propose.
All right. Thank you very much. May we have DLO? Deputy Leader of Opposition? Leader of Opposition, please can you check up on your partner if they are done to speak?
Yes, I've just messaged them now and communicated to see if their network failed. But if not, I'll Iron Man if they don't respond.
Okay, Miss, is Elo allowed to Iron Man?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, we'll just give DLO 2 minutes. I'll start the timer. If they don't come here within 2 minutes, Elo can Iron.
They're back online.
Yes, DLO, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. Let me just set up my timer.
You can begin now. DLO.
Okay. I'll set my timer now. Okay, so I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel. What is problematic is the way that opening government thinks that legitimate and internationally recognized bodies will be on board with such cruel acts that will cost them their credibility because they're protecting an individual who is responsible for mass human rights abuses, right? Who is responsible for killing other individuals to eliminate competition, right? We don't think that these international bodies have that kind of incentive, or they would risk their own reputation for those things, right? Proud to oppose, right? Okay, so firstly, they talk about these incentives, right? They talk about how detectors are paranoid.
Ryno, please pause the timer. DLO is not audible anymore. We'll just give her some time. I think she's having network issues. So I'll set up a different timer. And like a minute and 30 seconds so she can come back. Yes, you are. So you already are like a minute into your speech, but just to be fair, I think you should just start over. Ryno, could you just stop the old time and start a fresh one for her, just to be fair?
That's okay. I can
So
just
yeah, just do a countdown. No, just do a countdown so you can start. That's fine.
Oh, okay. Their own interests and policies that they're supposed to align to are going to be able to be on board with such cruel acts, right? We think that this is already going to cost them this things such as credibility, right? At a point in time where you have international bodies which engage in such corrupt activities, we don't that when you have an actual issue which needs things such as intervention, you're going to trust them because they might just do what they feel is okay, right? They might just protect the very same perpetrator whom you're going to report to them, whom you're going to tell them that, you know what, this person is responsible for killing someone or engaging in very paranoid, and they're going to accept this offer because they're not guaranteed of this immunity, right? We think that these dictators can already access this immunity, right? How do they already have access to it, right? Okay, so we talk about how the only reason why they are going to be granted that immunity is if someone reports them, right? So at a point in time where this thing is already going to happen, we don't think that not taken. At a point in time where they already are going to access it, right? We don't think that they are going to accept that offer, right? But even if we were to talk about how, even if we were going to talk about how they grant it to themselves, right? We don't think that on their side of the house, they have any way that they can hold these individuals accountable, right? But on our side of the house, when they do that, we have much more reasons to have these international bodies actually hold them accountable, right? On our side of the house, the model is going to be sanctioning these individuals. Are going to be things such as movements, right? And then they told you that individuals are going to die within those processes, right? We think that it is much better for individuals to die trying to fight for themselves, to fight for their freedom, than for them to continue with the government, which is not going to change, right? Our model's purpose is to simply throw away this dictatorship government and hopefully we get a democratic government. Individuals' rights are being respected, right? This policy, their policy is not going to work because the dictators have more incentives to reject it than to accept it, right? We think that at a point in time where someone is a dictator, the main reason why they're not going to accept it is because they want to remain in power, right? And they can already grant this to themselves, right? So we think that for them to actually accept this offer, they're supposed to have more incentives or a bigger purpose for actually offering them so that they can leave this power, right? Because they get more benefits by being in power than they're going to get after they get this immunity, right? But thirdly, it is a dictator, right? They can leave it to someone who's worse. So instead, they rather put those efforts in ways to end that dictatorship. And this is what a counter policy does, right? Now, how do you achieve all the benefits and address the root cause, right? Because firstly, we don't sanction the whole country. It's just that very same individual, right? But secondly, if they were worried about that dictator's death, they're not going to die. We're just going to sanction them, which means that their life is not going to be that one of equality life. They're still going to suffer for the rest of their life for those sins, right? But secondly, sanctions ensure that they're being held accountable. They held accountable of the person who's actually responsible for mass suffering, right? But thirdly, we get a better world because we take down the dictatorship government itself. Now on how their world is actually a worse world, right? Because it creates a cycle where they don't solve it once and for all, which means that if they offer this dictator this immunity, if a dictator comes next, they're still going to offer them this immunity, right? Which means that that cycle remains and they don't actually put an end to dictatorship, which means that their purpose is not to actually rescue the individuals, but rather to save the lives of dictators who are responsible for ending the lives of other individuals. We do not see how that is fair on their side of the house, right? But secondly, they protect the wrongdoers instead of the innocent individuals. We think that these international bodies or the governments that they talk about have a mandate, right? Have a purpose, which is to make sure that to ensure things such as human rights abuses do not happen, right? So at a point in time where they do condone these activities by offering dictators immunity, it simply means that they're going against their very own purpose, principles, and goals as a legitimate body. And at that point, we think that that body itself should be removed, right? But why is this bad? Because there is no justice on their side of the house, which means that those poor people who died because this dictator felt like they should die, they deserve to die or whatever, right? They're not going to get justice. The individuals who suffer in that country itself do not get justice. They're ignored, but rather they choose to protect the individual who's responsible for those people's deaths, for those people's suffering. But secondly, they undermine the rule of law itself, right? So it states that nobody is above the law, which simply means that each and every single president or anyone actually is supposed to be held accountable for what they do, right? At a point in time where these legitimate bodies are actually condoning such behaviors, it means that this idea of the rule of law itself is removed, right? As international bodies, since they're not part of that government, they actually have respect for this rule of law, right? But thirdly, people are not understood, which then perpetuates this entire cycle. Now, how are we better for all the stakeholders on our side of the house, right? Firstly, we hold the perpetrators responsible for the things that they did, right? But we do not kill them. They're rather just sanctioned to a miserable life, right? But secondly, we uphold the because of the idea of the rule of law, right? We give people this chance, right, to end this horrible cycle, right? So we tell you that the reason why our model is going to work is because not only are the international bodies involved, but also we're going to have things such as these social movements which are going to be happening, right? We think that at that point, that's when dictators are actually afraid because everyone is revolting against them because they can no longer have this power, right? What happens in countries with dictatorship countries, by the way, there's mass human rights abuses, which means that there aren't things such as voting or things such as the freedom of speech. But at a point in time where you have the individuals which are being governed by a dictatorship government and the international bodies working together, we think that we're much more able to take down this dictatorship. And in that kind of a world, we have
Yellow for speaking, we can hear you, although you're just a few minutes, a few seconds actually to end the speech. Miss, is it possible for her partner to just summarize in a few seconds so we'll just move on to the closing half?
How many
Yeah.
minutes left?
Sorry?
How much time does she have?
Yeah, she had just like 30 seconds left in her speech before she went off.
I think we can just move to closing. It's fine.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so member of government, may we have you? That's the end of the opening half.
Hello, everyone. Can I confirm if I'm audible though first?
Hello there. Yes, you're audible. We can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm Susanna Zulu. I'll prefer my POIs verbally. I won't be checking the check space, so you can feel free to unmute yourself and just say your, and if I take you can say your POI. If that's okay, then allow me to set up my. Okay, great. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the motion generally involves the depth of human empathy and justice. We are called to consider the lives shattered, the dreams extinguished, and the voices silenced by the tyranny of dictators. So because on our side, we sort of find a way to deal with this, we remain very proud to propose the motion. On opposition, because they believe that the punishment of a dictator who oppresses people has to be accrued by the basic individuals when they claim that sanctions are the best way to deal with this kind of problem. We think that that is something that is particularly problematic. We think that is something that is really worth regretting within the debate. We tell you about the thousands of children who died in Afghanistan as of last year due to hunger, right? This is because of the sanctions that were in fact imposed on the Taliban regime, right? The Taliban regime is not the one that died, it's the poor children that died. It's the hundreds of people that generally suffered the effects of that kind of scenario. Definitely not the Taliban regime that they're trying to actually try and deter. So we think if on opposition their claim is to say that they're going to punish dictators because they think that using sanctions, then we think that punishing innocent people is generally something that we won't really stand for, and why exactly something that we won't actually stand for. So the reason why this is particularly true is that particularly in the situation for Afghanistan, we think there were a lot of sanctions, like the economic sanctions, which generally reduced food imports into the country and actually made sure that food prices were increased. And at the end of the day, the base person, the average me, will not be able to afford literally a loaf of bread. So while the Taliban regime that has that wealth is able to afford that kind of thing. So at the end of the day, the people who really suffer in these dictatorships are not the dictators themselves when you sanction them, but in fact it's the people at the bottom, the people who are right there, and the people who are going to suffer at the bottom are the people who are actually going to suffer the effects of the sanctions. So at the end of the day, you don't really do that kind of thing. So what happened then on opening half is that you have proposition generally telling you the whole idea of saying that the UN is the one that is actually going to do this, right? So we'll tell you why. You ask why, you tell us that you think, opposition tells us that, well, we think that the UN particularly doesn't have an incentive to do this kind of thing. Simple response to this is that the UN in particular has an incentive to do this. Why? We think firstly the United Nations has an incentive for humanitarian intervention, right? To assist the vulnerable. Because we tell you that the people who suffer in a dictatorship are actually like the vulnerable. Opening already told you why exactly there is things like oppression, things like killing people who are at the bottom. That's the kind of problems that you then face, right? So we think that these people, because the United Nations in particular has that kind of incentive, they're likely to do this. But secondly, we think that they have an incentive for peacekeeping, right? Just to prevent conflicts, but also promote peace and stability, like internationally, right? So we think this, like for example,
Right.
in the 2000s, where the UN facilitated negotiations between between the Afghans and the Taliban, right? We think they have done these things and they have prioritized international stability at some point. So we think that nothing stops them from doing the same, even in this particular instance, right? So proposition clearly tells you why exactly these detectors are actually going to have an incentive to actually step down. What you tell us is that, well, we think that they don't, because basically we think they are dictators, and dictators, though, they are not really afraid of that. We think if dictators are really as bad as you, even if that is true, to say that they are as bad, if dictators are really as bad as you claim them to be, then we think that and the way you frame them to say that they don't really care about a lot of people, to say that they would be selfish and they would prioritize their own interests and their own safety, so they are definitely more likely to take this. But now let's talk about why we think that on our side you're likely to get more peaceful transitions, and why the whole chat about then transitions is something important. We think that removing a dictator from power leads to removing a dictator from power through things like coups generally leads to instability and even like civil wars, while offering an immunity then provides a peaceful transition and promotes stability, right? So why is this particularly true, to say that when a dictator actually like steps down, there's likely to be something like that? We've already told you that if dictators on your side are so bad and they are likely to prioritize their own safety, so they're then going to be willing to actually engage in these kinds of peaceful talks and generally make sure that they have this kind of free pass, right? Because we think that in your side, in as much as you claim that you want to hold these dictators accountable and everything, we've already proven to you why at the end of the day, the people that you're allegedly holding accountable for in fact being tortured by these dictators are the people at the bottom, the basic human being who doesn't have that much power, and why we think that we ought to prioritize those people at the end of the day and not these dictators. Because we think that on our side, when it comes to weighing, we would rather have one person roaming freely for the sake of at least some sort of basic human dignity for the rest of the country, at least some
Point
sort
to the
of basic
speaker.
human dignity for the rest of the people within that particular region. I'll take you.
So please may you explain for a point of clarity as to how your world is actually beneficial when, so magically these governments and political systems just magically change to this wonderful place where there's democracy. So please explain as to how your world actually promotes democracy when dictatorship systems are still in place.
Cool. So tell you firstly is that the fact that dictatorship systems are in place generally is the very reason why you get things like not having democracy actually like prevailing and things like that. But also we think that the fact that this debate then takes place in a context of a country that already has a dictator generally tells you that you have that kind of repression, right? So these people generally have actually like are violent towards maybe even their own oppositions, right? So the reason why we think that a coup is something that is particularly likely is to say that we have things like the military, right, that is likely to rise against these people, but also we have things like the elites within that particular setup, which are likely to be maybe like military generals and things like and people like that who are likely to do these kinds of things. So the reason why even on your side you cannot then achieve that kind of democracy is to say that you have dictators in power. We think that the fact that you claim that the criminal cost of justice is actually going to take care of these things is the reason why Kim Jong-un is still in power, the reason why Putin is still in power. So we think that at least if we give these people an incentive to go, if we give these people some sort of, and if we try and make sure that the basic people in the country get some sort of dignity and actually avoid things like coups, we think we remain very proud to propose a motion.
Perhaps thanks member of government for that speech. May we have member of opposition?
All right, so good evening, everyone. I'm Barry Kamanga. I'm the opening, well, the closing government's first speaker. So, key things that I want to note. I want to thank my teammate Kudakwashe for helping me get here. I couldn't have done this without him. Never expected to get this far. I would like to thank my coaches. Special shout out to Coach Mutembe and Coach Clive for the extra practice before this tournament. Also, I want to note that I'll take my POIs audibly, and could I have my personal pronouns being he, him. Also, I want to note that in the instance in which my Wi-Fi cuts because of the loss of power in my house, could someone just call me so that I can just try to do the speech through the phone call. But otherwise, before I begin my speech, thank you all and good luck to the remainder of this debate. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The government stands to ensure that there's some form of legal protection. These leaders that we look up to are those who are supposed to protect us in all facets of our world. It's very tragic to see these dictators such as Hitler, Mussolini, come up and take control of the entirety of the world and actually lead us to our death. That is significantly something that we regret in the entirety of this world. But we want to note that within the variety of different speeches that have come through, there have been no real significant way in ensuring that this doesn't occur. Thus, we're so honored to oppose the side proposition because they have failed to essentially give us a way to prevent this. What can you expect from this significant speech? I'm going to give you rebuttal, I'm going to give you characterization, I'm going to give you argumentation that essentially justifies the entirety of our case. Now, let's get into the wonderful rebuttal. There's a flimsy case made by opening government. Firstly, they talk about how in itself they're going to operate this policy under the notion that the UN is essentially going to do, quote unquote, remove all information about these crimes. We find it quite significant that at the end of the day, they're justifying censorship of information that has existed within status quo. They are willing to censor the horrible atrocities committed by these evil people and allow them to walk freely. They are allowing these people to not be held accountable. Why doesn't this not align with the UN's current interests? Firstly, on the grounds that since these presidents commit these crimes, at the end of the day, it is not in the interest for the UN to implement the system on the notion that, firstly, we need to ensure that there is some form of accountability provided to those who are leading these aggressor nations, because at the end of the day, the UN has sworn to the entirety of the world that they're going to protect these people, that they're going to show that accountability is provided internationally. I rejected you. Please do not badger. Secondly, to implement censorship in the nations is something that they don't even want to implement in their world, because clearly there won't be real clarity and they advocate for clarity in their own organization. It justifies the reasons as to why they would not implement this policy entirely. But why is it not effective? It's not effective under the notion that I gave, under the POI that I gave your speaker. I told him that firstly, if they already have this immunity whilst they're being presidents, then significantly they won't have an incentive to have immunity at the end of the day for two significant reasons. Firstly, as a president, you already have power because you're already a dictator and you're already controlling people, and you continue on to commit these mass atrocities. You as a person have a lot of power and immunity. It means that you're less likely going to have protection, because yes, the government might not be able to try you and put you into jail, but significantly people just show up at your door, shoot you for the atrocities that you've committed. Rejected. Panel, we feel that is not an incentive to operate this system, because immunity doesn't really establish real significance within the entirety of the world. We feel as though they're lying to you, panel, when they say that they can actually make some form of change by providing this incentive that these people will be safe, and they say that at the end of the day, because of this fear, these dictators will actually just try to do this. Always going to stay as these presidents, as these dictators, to maintain power and to control everyone. That's why they kill as many political competition as possible, so that no one can challenge this authority and no one can challenge this power, not simply for fear, simply just for power, panel. We think that is entirely their case. But before I move on to my next point of rebuttal, I'll give you a POI to defend your horrible case.
So if these dictators continue to become increasingly paranoid because you're trying to prosecute them, won't it be easier for them to just gain immunity by just taking this offer?
No, not really, because at the end of the day, why would they be scared? That's the thing that you failed to prove us. Because I told you that at the end of the day, they don't have this fear. I mean, if they had this fear, then we would have seen them doing much more outrageous stuff like, oh no, let me bomb the UN because I'm scared that they're going to try kill me. Significantly, you see Putin committing these huge atrocious crimes secretly and still not get in trouble. Do you really think that he's really scared of this UN that has failed to essentially do what you're talking about? No, he's not scared of it. And I think that just proves my case at the end of the day. Moving on to the problems with our opening opposition. We feel those sanctions are ineffective under the notion that they don't even tell us what type of sanctions are they going to use. Are they going to use military? Are they going to use economic? Are they going to use whatever? I do not know. So any sanction that you try to implement is not really quite clear to me. Because yes, if it may affect the person as an individual, there's no real reason as to why they will be stopped. Because firstly, you didn't prove it. Secondly, there's sanctions on Russia, yet you see Putin continuously making these vast approaches against Ukraine. So the entirety of that case, of that policy, just falls flat entirely. We feel that that is a tragic thing to see in the entirety of your case, and we feel that that is something that we don't opt for on our side of opposition. Moving on to necessary characterization, we want to note that these presidents do not commit crimes with that the world doesn't operate on the notion that you commit a crime and you don't get held accountable. They speak about how in itself there is no real way of ensuring like these guys get removed. We want to tell you that there is military action. Panel, when we have real action, we can actually make significant change. Thus, the only people who've made history are those who have made action within their lifetime. You see people who go to war with nations simply because they're being oppressed, or at the end of the day, they're doing something horrible. Significantly, it's that action that we value inside opposition. We are willing to send soldiers to stop these people from continuing on to hold these things, holding these things problematic. And to that extent, panel, we feel that that is the most important thing in this debate. Now, the 2 points that I'm going to give you in this speech: principle of justice and accountability. Moving on to the line of principle of justice, we want to maintain a principle where everyone is equally held to the same judicial system. It means that people are not just given like leeway to continue on committing crimes. Because significant, yes, if this president has committed crimes as a presidential candidate and now they're giving this immunity, at the end of the day, you cannot hold them accountable for the crimes that they will eventually commit. It means that they can commit tax evasion and not get held accountable. How do you advocate for such a system, panel? A system that actually does maintain the principle of justice and does not essentially ensure that there's accountability. They don't necessarily prove where accountability exists on their side of the house. And significantly, panel, we feel so that is something very horrible to regret from their side of the house. As the opposition, we stand honored to oppose such horrible cases that don't even show us real ways to hold people accountable, on the grounds that they don't show us how we prevent these dictators from continuously damaging the entirety of their world. We feel so that is something entirely you're so honored to oppose, and we're so honored to end their coffin just like that. Thank you so much, panel.
Thank you very much. May we have government whip to wrap up the case for the government bench?
Can you confirm I'm audible?
You are very much audible.
Okay, right. My name is Nomthandazo, and I'm taking POIs verbally, but please do not budge up because you would be disturbing us. On that note, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, too scared to leave the power because there are too many sins to pay for the moment you leave. Dictators clung on to that seat, not giving a damn on who suffers or who dies or who lives in terror. Panel, get this. This is the world that side opposition is proposing, a world that is filled with tension, a world that is filled with violence, a world with no conflict resolution. But down from the bench, our stance is very simple. What we tell you is to win some, you have to sacrifice some. To win economic stability, to win the very same political stability that side opposition is vouching for, you have to sacrifice some. And in this instance, it's just letting these people go. Now get this. What this debate has turned into is why exactly the international bodies and the regional bodies have an incentive to actually be the ones who vouch for this dictators immunity. So what I'll do in this debate is tell you how the first half has went down and how government side generally takes this
Points, Madam
debate and why then we rank behind. Sorry.
Points, Madam Speaker.
Okay, sorry, I will just continue. I didn't get that. Now, from down the bench, we've already told you the intrinsic nature of these dictators. We've told you that they are oppressors. They are people who kill anything that stays in their that stands in their way. We've told you how ruthless they are and how they are going to continue holding on to that seat because they know that whatever awaits them outside is very dangerous. It's actually crazy for side opposition to come here and claim that there is nothing that they are scared of, panel, because we've already given you examples of the rulers who have continued staying in that same position because they are scared to leave. We've told you of the rulers who have overstayed their term because they know that there are situations or there are scenes that they are waiting for, panel. Now, we simply tell you of the incentive that the international bodies have, panel. We tell you that their incentive is to create in countries to ensure that because panel, what my speaker tells you simply is that the moment we allow those people to continue staying in power because they are scared of this immunity that awaits them outside, they continue making sure that the citizens live in terror. They continue making sure that the citizens live very uncomfortable lifestyles. The reason why then, panel, they continue clinging on to that power is because they are scared of the situations, scared of the crimes that they have to suffer for when they get outside. But the world that we are proposing to you is a world that is immunity, a world that is going to facilitate a smooth transition of power to avoid what currently happens in the status quo. We have people dying due to coups. We have people dying due to civil wars that actually rise as a result of the presidents or of the state bodies who have stayed because they are scared to live. We have state presidents who have stayed more than their terms, 38 years, because they are scared of whatever awaits them from outside. Hence, this just facilitates a very rough transition of power, where we find people dying from civil rights, where we find people dying from coups, where we find the very same international bodies that side opposition believes they would not have an incentive to actually vouch for this immunity if they do. Now, panel, what we simply tell you is that immunity incentivizes a peaceful transfer of power without any added violence or without any bloodshed. We're going to tell you about what happened in Zimbabwe 2017 when all the streets were echoing with gunshots and everything because the president who had ruled for more than 38 years was refusing to leave the power because he was scared of whatever he was going to suffer. He was a dictator who was the economy was falling. The political system was falling. The very same systems that side opposition is trying to protect were falling because he was clinging onto that seat that he was so scared to leave because he was going to suffer all the repercussions. Pana, what we're simply telling you is that remove immunity so that we can get the stability that we need. Remove the immunity so that we can get a better region and we can get the very same better international regions. Now, what then side government tells you is that the reason why we do not want these dictators continuing living into that state is because of their ruling power. It is because of how they rule. It is because that they've created a society that is too scared to actually voice their concerns. They have created a society that is too scared to actually get what they want. But then side opposition fails to engage on that myth that they are scared to leave. That is why they continue clinging on to those seats. They are scared to leave. That is why for them to be forced to leave, they're supposed to be coups, they're supposed to be civil wars. And we totally regret such a world. Now, we've already told you about why Putin continues being in power. It's because he's scared that the moment he leaves, the UN is on his case because they are trying so hard to make sure that he suffers for whatever he has done to his people. We tell you that Robert Mugabe was scared to leave his seat because he was scared that the moment he leaves his seat, all his problems are going to go after him. Now, why then we rank above side opposition? It's because we best cater for the stakeholders of this debate. We think that the stakeholders of this debate are the citizens who are suffering from this dictatorship rule, the citizens who are suffering from this rule that these people have the authoritarian rule. But then the moment they continue being in power because they are scared to leave that seat is putting the lives of the citizens at risk, panel. Secondly, why we then
rank above side opposition is because we tell you what is more likely to happen when the immunity is not served. Because panel, fine, we can come here and tell you that they should get immunity because there is going to be a free transfer of power and whatever, but not necessarily what will happen when we do not get the immunity. Now, when we get deep into it and tell you that the problems that we're suffering in the status quo are coups, are civil wars, because of the other parties who are trying to remove whatever dictatorship government is in space because they have refused to leave that power. Hence, we have a continuous rise in coups, a continuous rise in civil wars, putting the lives of the very same civils that we are trying to cater for in this debate. Now, we rank above opposition as side government because we show you and we directly show you that we tackle this whole problem of removing the dictators out of the seat and letting them roam free. And panel, I repeat, for us to win the economic stability that we need, for us to improve the systems that we need, there's no need to punish the whole general public for something that someone has done, because this is just a way of proving that the UN of proving that the people have power or something, but it is not a way of actually creating the stability that we need in the countries. Hence, we create a world where there is stability, we create a world where there is peace and unity. I'm proud.
The House thanks government for that fine speech. May we have opposition to wrap up the debate?
Just to confirm audibility.
You are very much audible.
All right, I'll begin my speech. I prefer verbal pure eyes. My name is Kudakwashe, and I would like to thank Barry Kamanga for carrying me throughout this tournament. And I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, panel, I have a serious bone to pick with side proposition's case. The whole case is hinged upon the facts that, or rather the speculation that these dictators, they actually have a fear, right? What do they fear? They fear repercussions and they fear accountability. But what if I come here to tell you that I am able to discredit this whole case and thus topside government over? Well, firstly, where is our proof that these dictators actually do not have the fear that side proposition so leans upon? So basically, let's view the world like this. We have Vladimir Putin acting like he's the ruler of the world and trying to take back countries that were previously combined before. We don't necessarily believe that his ideology is being forced upon the rest of everyone else. Is something that is shown by someone who's fearful. Nextly, what do we have from another dictator, Kim Jong-un? We necessarily have him threatening people constantly with his nuclear war bombs and his shallow army, right? Maybe he has many men, but we don't really see a society, we don't really see a world where a country so impoverished would actually have well-fed soldiers. So necessarily to say that Kim Jong-un is showing off with grandmas holding guns. We don't necessarily believe that these dictators necessarily have fears of the outside world. We necessarily believe that they are pompous and they have grown incredibly intoxicated with their power. They are not used to the fact that accountability is a thing, but rather they believe that they are able to find their way out of certain situations. I'll take one from Lethu.
So aside closing opposition, how do you get dictators to stop killing people?
All right. Let me come here and say this. I want to show you the true incentives of the dictators, the core incentive. So in order to show how we would actually stop this rampage from dictators, what we could actually do is just give them, give them money. You would rather just bribe them with money and say, just step down and it will all be fine. With their intoxication of power, really looking at them from this perspective, you don't necessarily see them thinking ahead to the degree that you think of. Necessarily what brought them to this dictatorship. We think that what brought them to this dictatorship is the hunger for power. Otherwise, if they were so scared of their competitors and being shocked, then they would never become a dictator in the first place. They'd rather value the means of democracy and simply just obey the rules and play the game fairly. But necessarily, what incentive drove them to the fact that they want to accomplish something that's greater than their fear? While this incentive is actually the goal of resources. What these dictators crave is resources and a publicity stunt to spread their ideologies. We don't necessarily believe that these dictators would actually vie for a world where they actually don't have money. And before they even receive their rewards, a soldier comes into the country and then arrests them immediately before they could spend a penny. I'll take that point.
The speaker suggesting that we
Right.
should
So
reward
if
instead of trying to give them immunity, therefore basically giving our entire case, except for the fact that they're probably just going to go to jail anyway.
Excuse you, but this is not immunity per se. We are not saying that we are protecting them from any harm. We're saying that we're going to lure them with the resources that they so desire. We're going to use their incentives against them in order to get them out of this position. And nextly, what do we want to come in to say? We want to come in to say that we're providing them with resources, not immunity. You're badgering, leave me alone. So basically what we're trying to say in this debate is that we don't necessarily see a world where these dictators are actually starting to think logically and say that, oh, I'm so fearful of my competitors, so I'll let them get a chance. I don't want to be hated. I don't want to be shot in the back. So I will actually play the rules of the game and spend my time in presidency. If they so had such a fear of their competitors, then this would be the actual case in society. But no, they don't have this fear. So what brought them to this? The hunger for resources. We don't necessarily believe that Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un necessarily came here for nothing. We believe that instead they came to that position, they came to that stance, to that fear, because they are hungry for power. If we attract them with these resources that they so desire, then necessarily to say they would actually be lured by that, and we could then swindle them and get them under the rug.
Point to the
Next
speaker.
thing, what I want to go on to, why is it so improbable not taken? Why is it so improbable that they accept the offer on your side? Well, nextly, I want to say, because what opportunities would they have for resources in their future? No mention of side proposition actually catered for the key desires of these dictators and the key principles, the key incentives that they follow. Nextly, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that necessarily they don't cater for the fact that these people are money hungry. So necessarily to say, yes, you get immune, but then what is your resume? Your resume is, I've been a dictator for 20 plus years, hire me. No, we don't expect them to believe that they would actually get a stable income at bare minimum from that. We actually believe that these dictators would rather vie for a world where they're actually still upholding power, even if that power is fictional in their case, so that they could actually stay in a position in order to oppress others. We believe that if we lure them with this technique, not promising any legal immunity, we could actually hold them accountable and thus set free the people who are actually suffering truly. We don't necessarily vie for a world where these dictators are free to rampage constantly, but we allow them to actually get oppressed themselves after they get imprisoned for their actions. Is there any pure art?
Yes, Speaker. So how does your model actually work when these dictators have amassed so much wealth as a result of being a dictator? So what incentive do they have to actually get these resources when they already had endless amounts of resources from that nation as a result of exploitation? Please engage.
Dictators, right? So they necessarily come here to say that dictators are amongst the richest people on earth. This is not the truth. We actually have people who topple these dictators over. Giving them an attractive amount of wealth is actually something that could lure these dictators. They don't necessarily have their own bank account, right? We don't see Kim Jong-un ruling the poorest country in the world, being one of the top 10 billionaires in the world, right? We necessarily believe that these dictators still have limitations. Please acknowledge that a country's resource is not infinite. So basically, we are trying to say that these dictators, they don't need bank accounts when the national reserves are right there. They necessarily go for that. So necessarily, if we give them something that they cannot refuse, then they will go for that. If we show you that, and if we have shown you, and since we have shown you that the true incentives of these dictators is resources, then necessarily them going for that would actually deal with this whole problem. I don't necessarily believe that side proposition's world is a world that's viable for anyone. And with that, I believe that this case is closed and suicide government's coffin.
The House would like to thank everyone for their wonderful speeches. My panelists can go and wait for me in OG prep, sorry. Thank you all for the wonderful finals. Good luck to you all. Please return to the briefing room for the beginning of the closing ceremony while we go and deliberate and come up with the rankings for the finals. Good luck to the winners that will soon be announced. Yeah.
Thank you for the debate.